I was on a business trip and video called my wife. She answered fast and said she was alone. But when she accidentally turned the camera, I saw her boss's ID badge on our bed. I stayed silent and booked the first flight home. When I arrived, he opened the door and they both panicked. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments what city you're watching us from. I met Vivian at a time when I still didn't have much to offer besides willingness and determination. I had just come out of a 4-year relationship that left a son, Cowan, who at the time was 7 years old, and slept in a room next to mine in a rented apartment, which I shared with a friend in the ABC region of Sao Paulo. It wasn't a life of extreme hardship, but it was a tight life, the kind where you calculate the supermarket bill before going in and choose the health plan by price, not coverage. Vivian came into my life in a simple way, with no initial drama. It was at a coworker's birthday party in a backyard barbecue in Sano Andre, with that easy late-night conversation, where people are already relaxed and speak the truth faster than they should. She was 27, worked at a small consulting firm, had a direct way of speaking that I wasn't used to, and that caught my attention before anything else. We dated for 2 years, then she moved in with me, then we got married. And when Cowan came to live with us for good, at 15, after his mother moved to the interior of Parana, Vivian didn't complain, didn't demand, didn't set conditions. She just said, "We'll adapt." And we adapted. 11 years passed like that. It wasn't a perfect life. No life is, but it was a life built, brick by brick, with work and combination. I grew within the engineering field, moved from small projects to larger contracts, started traveling more, staying away for weeks at a time on distant construction sites. Vivian also grew within her consulting firm, got promoted, gained more responsibility, started working on bigger projects and with a team I knew by name, but never up close. Gustavo Meirelles had been the director of her department for 3 years. I knew he existed the way we know people exist in our spouse's workplace, by the name that appears in office stories, by a passing comment, by the inevitable mention when the boss makes a decision that affects the routine. Gustavo asked to advance the delivery. Gustavo approved the project. Nothing that seemed beyond what it was, nothing that sparked anything. That Wednesday night, it was late November. There was 1 week left until the break from the works in Porto Velho. I had spent the day at a construction site 40 minutes from the city on a state highway. We were recovering under a government contract. The sun in the north of the country in November isn't the same as the sun in Sao Paulo. It's a physical, heavy thing that sticks to your neck and doesn't come off even after a shower. When I got to the hotel, it was almost 8 at night. I showered, ate something the ground floor restaurant still served, and went up to my room. I called Vivian at 10. She answered quickly in less than 2 rings. I remember this because the week before she had taken longer, and the one before that she had let it go to voicemail once. This time she answered quickly with a smile that appeared before she even said anything. "Hi, love. I miss you." Her voice was calm. The tone was that specific way of someone who's comfortable, in no hurry, with no tension in their body. She was sitting. From the camera angle, you could see part of the ceiling of our room behind her. I asked how her day had been. She said it had been long, a meeting in the morning, a report in the afternoon, that she was exhausted, but well. She asked about the construction site, about the heat, about whether I was eating right. They were the usual questions, the usual conversation. And then she said, "Let me show you how quiet the apartment is without you." And she turned the camera. She turned it slowly. The intention was to show the living room in the background. But before reaching the living room, the camera passed over the bed. It lasted less than 2 seconds. She didn't even notice. She continued talking while showing the room, commenting that she had left the window open because it was hot, that Cowan had had dinner earlier and gone to his room. I heard all this, but what I was seeing was the badge. It was on top of the pillow on the left side of the bed. My side, a white badge with a blue lanyard with the consulting firm's logo in the corner, and the name printed in black letters that I read without difficulty, even in the quick camera angle. Gustavo Meirelles, Project Director. I know that name. That was the exact thought that went through my head. It wasn't anger. It wasn't that immediate sting that appears in movies. It was an almost bureaucratic recognition of the kind that happens when a piece of information fits into a place you didn't know was waiting for it. Like when you find a bill you thought you had paid and discover you hadn't. The feeling isn't surprise, it's confirmation. Vivian turned the camera back to her own face. She continued talking. I answered, I don't know exactly what I said, but I said something in the right tone because she didn't notice any difference. We stayed on the call for a few more minutes. She yawned once, said she was sleepy, that she was going to bed early. I told her to rest. She blew a kiss. I returned it. The call ended. I stared at the black phone screen for a while. The air conditioner continued, making the same old machine noise. Down below, through the window, the street in Porto Velho had that hot city at night movement. People outside bars, the muffled sound of some music, everything completely normal, completely oblivious to what had just happened inside me. I need to be honest about what I felt at that moment, because it would be easy to say I felt anger and leave it at that. But it wasn't anger, at least not yet. It was that specific feeling of when the ground changes texture under your feet, without warning, of when you realize you were stepping on a place that seemed solid and wasn't. It's not falling. It's the realization that the fall has already happened some time ago, and that you were just late to understand. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed, took the glass of water that was on the nightstand, and drank it slowly. Then I picked up the phone again and opened the ticket app. I searched for flights from Porto Velho to Sao Paulo for the next day. The first available one left at 6:40 in the morning with a connection in Brasilia, arriving in Guarulhos at 10:30. It cost more than the ticket I had bought for the end of the week. I bought it without hesitation. I didn't even think about the price, which is unusual for me because I always think about the price. Then I sent a short message to Fabio, the engineer who shared responsibility for the construction site with me. Fabio, I had to bring my return forward due to a family matter. You take over until Friday. Any construction decision that can't wait, call me on my cell. I sent it and put the phone on the table. I didn't call anyone else. I didn't text Vivian. I didn't do anything that could anticipate anything. I lay on the hotel bed with my clothes still on and stared at the ceiling. That badge was on my bed, on my side of the bed. It wasn't dropped in a hurry to hide. It wasn't forgotten in a discreet corner. It was on the pillow on my side, as if the place where I've slept for 11 years had been occupied with a naturalness that completely erased me from the scene. And the detail that wouldn't leave my mind, no matter how much I tried to organize my thoughts in another direction, was this. She didn't notice. She turned the camera without fear, without hesitation, without calculating what was on display, because for her at that moment, that was so incorporated into her routine that she didn't even register it as a danger. That said more than any word she could have said. I closed my eyes. I didn't fall asleep right away, but at some point between thought and silence, the day's exhaustion won. I woke up at 4:30 in the morning to the alarm I had set before going to bed. I got up, took a cold shower, put only the essentials in my backpack, left the rest of the clothes in the suitcase inside the hotel closet. I went down, checked out, went to the taxi the hotel called for me. In the early morning Porto Velho airport, there's a strange quiet, the kind of place that operates in slow motion, with few people and a lot of artificial light. I checked in, went through security, sat on a plastic chair near the boarding gate, and waited. I didn't open my phone, I didn't put on headphones, I didn't read anything. I just waited the way you wait, when there's nothing you can do before you get to the place where things will need to be resolved. With the patience of someone who has already understood that acting too quickly is useless, that what will happen when I open that door depends on how I arrive, not on how long it takes to get there. The flight boarded on time. The gray Corolla was in the visitors' parking spot of the building when Cowan got home. It was a Tuesday in September, a little over 3 months before the Porto Velho trip. Cowan had left college early because the afternoon class had been canceled due to a professor's absence, one of those common situations at the end of the semester that, under normal circumstances, would be a cause for satisfaction. He went up in the elevator with his backpack on and headphones in, thinking about nothing more than eating something and lying down. When he opened the apartment door, Vivian was in the living room, just her sitting on the sofa with the laptop on her lap, a cup of coffee on the coffee table, the television off. She looked up when he came in, without surprise, without any change in her face. I thought you had class until 6, she said. It was canceled, Cowan replied, throwing his backpack on the chair by the entrance. Oh. She went back to her laptop. Cowan went to the kitchen, opened the fridge, stood for a few seconds looking inside. Not really looking for anything. He took a glass of water, drank it standing up, leaning against the counter. And it was at that moment, while putting the glass in the sink, that he heard the noise. It came from the hallway. The sound of someone stepping slowly on the wooden floor of the hall that connected the living room to the bedrooms. The kind of footstep of someone trying not to make noise. He stood still. A man came out of the hallway, in his early 40s. A navy blue dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to the elbow, fabric pants, dress shoes that he had put on in a hurry because the lace on the right foot was poorly tied. A man Cowan had never seen inside that apartment. Had never seen anywhere. The man stopped when he saw Cowan in the kitchen. They looked at each other for a moment that was short on the clock and long in everything else. Vivian got up from the sofa quickly, not running, but with that speed of someone who needs to control a situation before it controls itself. She went into the kitchen, stood between the two of them, and said with a calmness that only exists when it's been rehearsed, "Cowan, this is Gustavo. My director. He stopped by to pick up some project documents that I had brought home to work on." Gustavo extended his hand. "Hi, Cowan, I've heard about you." Cowan shook his hand, said nothing more than a one-syllable hi. Gustavo picked up a thin folder that was on the kitchen counter. A folder Cowan hadn't noticed when he opened the fridge, but that was there already prepared, waiting to be used as an excuse, and said he had to go. He said goodbye to Vivian with a wave. To Cowan with a half-smile and left. The apartment door closed. Vivian stayed in the kitchen facing Cowan. She waited a second as if testing the ground, and then said in a way that was neither a request nor an order, but that carried both at the same time, "You don't need to say anything to your father." "There's nothing to say." Cowan remained silent. "It was just documents." She added. He picked up the backpack he had dropped on the chair, went to his room, and closed the door. That night, Renato was in Sao Paulo on a short break between projects, and the three of them had dinner together. Pasta that Vivian had made, the table set, the television on in the background with the news that no one was really watching. Renato asked his son how college had been. Cowan said it had been normal. Vivian served Renato more pasta without him asking, the way she always did. The conversation moved on to other topics. Cowan looked at his plate for most of the dinner. Renato didn't notice or noticed and didn't ask the right question. There were things that sometimes came close to touching and passed without connecting, like two cars on the highway in opposite directions that cross at the same second and are already gone. In the morning, before Renato left for the office, they had coffee together in the kitchen. Vivian was still sleeping. It was early. The light came through the hallway window at an oblique angle, leaving the kitchen half in darkness. Cowan was sitting with his cup in front of him, staring at the tabletop, and, at some point, he started to say something. He opened his mouth. The first words came out hesitantly, and then he stopped. Renato looked at his son. "What?" "Nothing." Cowan picked up his cup. "It's nothing, Dad." Renato stared for a second. There was something in that "it's nothing" that had a different weight from a usual "it's nothing." The phrase had the texture of something held back, of a word that returned before arriving, but Renato didn't push. He drank his coffee, looked at his watch, grabbed his car keys, and left. That was the moment. That was the exact moment when things could have gone a different way, and they didn't. Cowan sat alone in the kitchen for a while after his father left. Then he washed the cups, grabbed his backpack, and left for college. During the following weeks, Renato, unwittingly, without being aware he was doing it, assembled an inventory of small things that didn't quite add up. It wasn't suspicion yet. That diffuse discomfort of when something is slightly out of place. But you can't pinpoint what. Vivian coming home late with a frequency that had increased, not dramatically, not every night, but enough to be different from the previous pattern. A Friday when she said she had a meeting until late, came back at 10:30, showered before bed. On a Saturday morning, her cell phone rang on the nightstand too early. She grabbed it before the second ring and answered, leaving the room. Renato lay with his eyes open on the ceiling, listening to her muffled voice from the hallway. When she came back, he pretended to be asleep. She entered slowly, lay down with her back to him, was quiet. Renato was quiet too, and they both lay there, side by side, separated by 30 centimeters of mattress, and by a silence that neither of them had the courage to name. There was a dinner on a Saturday in October. Vivian had said it would be with the new project team, celebrating the approval of an important stage. She said it would be in a tame, that it would probably be long. Renato said okay. He stayed home, ordered pizza, watched a game where he didn't even root for any of the teams, but it was something to fill the time. At 11 at night. She hadn't come back yet. At midnight, a message. Still here. Won't be long. She arrived around 1 in the morning, lively, with that tone of someone who spent the night in an environment she enjoys. And Renato noticed, without being able to explain it well, that her liveliness was of a different quality than that of someone who spent the night with coworkers. But he didn't say anything. That's what he carried for months, the feeling and the silence about it. And there's an uncomfortable honesty in that. In recognizing that on some level he preferred not to know, not because he was a coward, but because the life they had built over 11 years had real weight. And undoing something with real weight requires a certainty that he didn't have yet or that he thought he didn't have. Because the truth is that when the cell phone camera passed over the bed and the badge appeared on the screen, the first thing Renato felt wasn't surprise. It was recognition, as if a part of him had known for longer than he had admitted to himself and was waiting for confirmation with the patience of someone who already knows what they'll find when they open the door, but still needs to open it. On the plane back to Sao Paulo, sitting in the window seat, with his seatbelt fastened and the tray table up, Renato stared at the savannah below until the savannah gave way to clouds. He thought about the gray Corolla that Cowan had found in the visitor's parking spot. He thought about the morning his son had started to say something and stopped. He thought about how many times he himself had stopped before asking the right question. There was a sequence of choices, and none of them had been innocent. Vivian's, Cowan's, his own. The plane landed in Brasilia for the connection. Renato disembarked, walked through the terminal, bought a coffee that he drank standing at a counter. Next to him, a man in a suit was talking loudly on his cell phone about a meeting that had gone wrong. Further on, 2 women with carry-on bags were waiting, one sleeping, the other looking at her cell phone, with that expression of someone reading something they'd rather not have read. Renato finished his coffee, threw the cup in the trash, and went back to the boarding gate. The second flight took 1 hour and 10 minutes. When the plane descended over Sao Paulo and the city appeared below with that immensity that always causes something in those who return after weeks away, Renato felt his stomach tighten slightly, not with fear, with anticipation. It was the difference between knowing what's waiting for you and still not knowing what it will be like when you're face to face with it. He hadn't told her he was coming. He wasn't going to. But in the taxi, already in Sao Paulo, when he asked the driver to go down Brigadeiro before taking the route to the apartment, and when he saw Gustavo Morel's gray Corolla parked in the consulting firm's director spot, with an identification sticker on the windshield that confirmed the name without a doubt, Renato realized there was one thing he still didn't know. If Gustavo was at work that Thursday morning, how long before had he left the apartment? And if he left early in the morning, what exactly had Cowan seen, heard, or chosen not to tell during all those weeks? The taxi continued, and that question remained unanswered for a few more kilometers. The taxi stopped at the light on Brigadeiro Faria Lima, and Renato looked out the window without moving. The consulting firm's building was dark glass and concrete, the kind of corporate facade that exists by the thousands in Sao Paulo and is only distinguished by the logo at the entrance. He knew the address because Vivian had mentioned it once in a conversation about traffic that the company had moved its headquarters 2 years ago, and now it took her 40 minutes by car in the morning rush hour. The gray Corolla was in the spot marked with a metal plaque screwed into the curb. Directorate. The sticker on the windshield had the full name printed in small font. Gustavo Meireles. The light turned green. The taxi moved on. Renato turned his face forward and said nothing to the driver. It was 10:20 on a Thursday morning. The apartment was 18 minutes away by the route the GPS was suggesting. Renato stared at the car's dashboard without seeing the dashboard. Doing a simple calculation. If Gustavo was at work at this time, he had left the apartment sometime in the morning, before 8 probably, because the consulting firm had that kind of corporate culture where directors arrive before schedule to show commitment. Which meant Vivian had been alone in the apartment for at least 2 hours, which meant she wasn't expecting anything different that morning. He hadn't warned her he was coming. That was the only trump card he had, and he knew it. The taxi turned onto a side street, then another. And the neighborhood's character changed, from commercial to residential, from office buildings to apartment buildings, with trees on the sidewalk and doormen at the entrances. Renato recognized every corner. It was the path he had taken hundreds of times. And yet, that morning, everything seemed slightly displaced, like a photo taken from the wrong angle of a familiar place. "You can stop here," he told the driver when there were 2 blocks left to the building. He paid in cash, got out with the backpack on his shoulder, walked the 2 blocks slowly, not out of hesitation, but because he needed the time. He needed to arrive at that door with his head in the right place, with no leftover adrenaline in his body, with nothing that could make him act before understanding the full extent of what was in front of him. He had learned that from years in construction. A decision made in anger costs more than a decision made calmly. Always. The building's doorman was Mr. Antonio, a man of about 55 who had worked there longer than Renato had lived in the apartment. When Renato entered the lobby, Mr. Antonio looked up from the counter with that expression of immediate recognition. "Engineer, you're back early." "I came early," Renato said with a short smile. "Everything okay here?" "Everything's quiet." Renato pressed the elevator button, and it was at that moment, while waiting for the doors to open, that Mr. Antonio said something with the naturalness of someone making small talk and having no idea of the weight of what he was saying. "Mrs. Vivian went down earlier today, around 7:30, said she was going to the market. She hasn't come back yet." Renato felt something tighten in his chest, but kept his face exactly as it was. "Oh, really?" "She told me," he said in the same tone as someone confirming a routine piece of information. The elevator doors opened. He got in, went up. The 5th-floor hallway was empty and silent, as it always was at that time on a weekday. The smell of the weekly cleaning was still in the air. That scent of floor cleaner that lasted until the afternoon. Renato stopped in front of the apartment door and stood there for 3 seconds. Not out of fear, by choice. It was the last time he would be on the outside without knowing exactly what he would find inside. He put the key in the lock, opened it. The first thing he noticed was the silence. It wasn't the silence of an empty apartment. It was the silence of an apartment tidied up in a hurry. The sofa cushion was slightly crooked, the kind of detail Vivian wouldn't let slide under normal circumstances. The living room window was ajar when she always left it closed in the morning because of the street noise, and there was a discreet but present scent of men's cologne in the air that he didn't use. He put the backpack on the floor near the entrance, stood in the middle of the living room for a moment. Then he walked to the bedroom. The bed was made, the pillows carefully replaced. The badge wasn't there anymore, obviously, but there was a detail that probably no one would have noticed if they weren't looking. The pillow on the left side, his side, had the pillowcase on inside out. The opening of the pillowcase that Vivian always left facing inwards was facing outwards. It was the kind of mistake that happens when someone is remaking a bed in a hurry and isn't thinking about the usual details. Renato stared at the pillow for a moment, then turned his back on the room and went to the kitchen. He filled a glass of water, drank it standing up, leaning against the sink, looking out the kitchen window at the wall of the neighboring building. He was hungry. He hadn't eaten anything substantial since the night before. The coffee from Brasilia Airport didn't count. He opened the fridge, looked at the contents without really seeing them. Closed it again. His cell phone vibrated. It was Vivian. He stared at the name on the screen for 2 rings, then answered. "Love?" Her voice was normal, completely normal. "Mr. Antonio saw you arrive and called me. Why didn't you tell me you were coming today?" And there was the near mistake. Renato hadn't calculated that the doorman would call her. It was such an obvious thing that he had missed, and now he was on a call he hadn't planned to have, needing to respond in a way that didn't give anything away. "I didn't want to worry you in the middle of the night," he said with a calmness that was built in real time. "Fabio, let me go early. I thought it was better to come back right away than to spend the whole weekend in a hotel." A 2-second pause, short, but he noticed. "Makes sense," she said. "I'm at the market. I'm on my way back. Do you want me to buy you something to eat? You can buy some bread. I'm fine. I'll be there in 20 minutes. She hung up. Renato put the phone on the kitchen counter and stared at it for a moment. 20 minutes. He had managed. Her voice hadn't given any sign that his answer seemed strange, and his hadn't given any sign that there was anything wrong. It was a skill he didn't know he had. This of keeping the surface intact while everything underneath was in motion. But there was something in the 2-second interval before makes sense that was stored away. She was also calculating. There were 2 players on a board where only one of them knew the game had started. Renato went to the bathroom, washed his face, looked at his own reflection for a moment. He had a 2-day beard, dark circles from not sleeping well. The crumpled shirt from the trip looked exactly like what it was. A man who had traveled overnight and just got home. That was good. That's what needed to appear. He went back to the living room, sat on the sofa, turned on the television on mute, kept his eyes on the screen, without processing anything that was passing. Cowan, he was thinking about him now. According to Mr. Antonio, Vivian had left at 7:30. Gustavo left before that, probably given that he was at work at 10, which meant that at some point in the early morning, maybe while Cowan was still sleeping or getting ready for college, that man had left that apartment as if it were a routine thing, as if his presence there had an established normality. 2 months. Vivian had asked Cowan not to tell. Renato kept thinking about how many mornings like that had happened. How many times Cowan had crossed the kitchen with his backpack on and gone down for his day carrying that. It wasn't anger at his son that he felt, at least not yet. It was something closer to the weight of understanding that Cowan's silence wasn't malice. But it had a cost that the boy hadn't yet grasped. The key turned in the lock 23 minutes later. Vivian came in with a grocery bag on her arm, her hair tied back, jeans, and a long-sleeve shirt. When she saw Renato on the sofa, the smile that appeared on her face was the kind that happens when a person has already rehearsed the smile on the way home and was ready to use it. "I missed you." She came to him, bent down, gave him a kiss. Her perfume was the same as always. "I missed you too," he said. She went to the kitchen, unwrapped the bread, put the kettle on the stove. Her movements around the apartment were natural, fluid, with nothing to give away tension. She was a woman at home on a Thursday morning, making coffee to welcome her husband who had come back earlier than expected. Renato stayed on the sofa, observing through the line of sight that the apartment's layout allowed. There was a question he needed to answer before anything else. Not about the cheating, not about Gustavo, not about the 8 months he still didn't know were 8 months. The question was more specific and more urgent. Did Cowan know he was back? Because if Vivian had called Cowan after getting the news from the doorman, and if Cowan didn't yet know how his father was arriving that day, without warning, unprepared, with everything he knew about the badge still kept inside, then his son would show up at the apartment that afternoon, not ready to face his father. And that conversation, when it happened, needed to be at the right time. Before the kettle whistled, Vivian called from the kitchen. "Coffee's ready." Renato got up from the sofa and went to the kitchen. And as they both sat at the table, and she placed the cup in front of him with that gesture of 11 years of living together, Renato realized that the hardest part wasn't knowing. It was knowing and waiting. It was sitting at the table, drinking the coffee, answering the right questions, and carrying the weight of it all, without letting any thread show on the surface until it was the right time to pull. Except he didn't know yet that same afternoon, when Cowan opened the apartment door and found his father sitting in the living room, it would be impossible to hide everything, because his son's face would give away what his words would never have the courage to say. "Dad." The word came out like air escaping a tight space. Cowan stopped in the middle of the entrance hallway, with his backpack still on his shoulder and the key in his hand. And for a whole second, his face was completely open, unfiltered, unprepared. The face of someone who was caught by surprise by a situation they had feared for weeks and woke up every day expecting without knowing exactly when it would arrive. Renato was sitting on the sofa with a glass of water in his hand. He hadn't stood up when he heard the key in the lock. He stayed exactly where he was, in the same position he always was when he got home from work, as if nothing that day had been different from any other. "Hi," he said, simple, without a loaded intonation, without the weight the situation had. Cowan swallowed hard. "I didn't know you were coming back today. I came early." His son closed the door behind him. He took off his backpack with a movement too slow to be natural. He put it on the chair by the entrance the way he always did and stood there for a moment, not knowing whether to move into the living room or stay where he was. There was a conversation that the space between them was asking for, and they both knew it, and neither of them was heading towards it yet. Vivian had gone to the salon in the early afternoon. She had said so while having coffee with that lightness of a daily schedule that had a blow-dry appointment made 2 weeks ago, and she was going to take advantage of it. Since she was home, Renato had said that was fine. She had left around 1 in the afternoon. It was almost 4 now. When Cowan came in, "Did you have lunch?" Renato asked at college. "Sit down." It wasn't an order. It was an invitation with little room for refusal. Cowan came to the living room, sat on the side armchair, the one at an angle to the sofa, put his elbows on his knees, and stared at a vague spot in the direction of the turned-off television. Renato said nothing for a moment. He let the silence linger, not as pressure, but as space. It was a technique he had learned in years of contract negotiation. Sometimes, the person on the other side fills the silence with exactly what you needed to know, if you have enough patience not to speak first. Cowan couldn't take more than 20 seconds. "How's Porto Velho?" "Normal," Renato replied. "Work is moving." "Huh." Pause. "Did you come straight from the airport?" "I passed by Brigadeiro before." Renato said this with no special inflection, like geographical information. Traffic was bad on the normal route. Cowan nodded, looking to the side. And it was at that moment that Renato realized his son was waiting to understand how much his father knew before deciding what to say. It wasn't malice. It was the preservation instinct of someone who had been in an impossible position for 2 months and had developed the habit of testing the ground before stepping. It was a behavior Renato recognized because it was similar to his own, and that made everything heavier, not easier. "Cowan." His voice came out low, direct. "I saw the badge on the video call." His son closed his eyes for a second, just 1 second. Then he opened them and stared at the coffee tabletop with an expression that was the exact portrait of someone who had carried something too far and had just been authorized to put it down. "When did you see it?" Cowan asked without looking up. "Last night." A long pause. "That's why you came back today." "That's why." Cowan ran his hand over his face from top to bottom, slowly, the gesture of someone trying to reorganize what they're feeling before speaking. When he lowered his hand, his face had a different expression, not of relief exactly, but of something that comes after a long time pretending a weight doesn't exist. "I found out because of the car," he said, "in September. The Corolla that was in the parking spot." "I know." She asked me not to say anything. He looked at his father for the first time since he had sat down. She said she would solve it, that it was a passing thing, that it didn't need to become a bigger problem than it was. Renato remained silent, not agreeing, not disagreeing, just listening. "I didn't know what to do, Dad." Cowan's voice had changed texture, become rougher, like someone speaking from a place they don't usually speak from. "If I told you, and it was a lie, or something you two had already resolved that I didn't know about, I would have created a problem for nothing. And if I told you and it was true," he stopped. "I couldn't." "I understand," Renato said. And he understood. He didn't agree, but he understood the difference between the two things. "Did it happen more than once?" he asked. Cowan nodded slowly. "The car showed up about 3 times that I saw. It could have been more when I wasn't here." "Were you always home when he was here?" "No. One time I saw the car arriving as I was leaving early in the morning. I left without going back up." A pause. "I couldn't stay here." There was in that last sentence a weight that Renato hadn't anticipated. The image of his 19-year-old son leaving his own building early in the morning because he couldn't be in the apartment where that was happening. That was something that entered a specific place inside Renato and stayed there. "It's okay," he said, not as absolution, as fact. Cowan's cell phone vibrated on the table. He looked at the screen out of reflex. He turned the phone face down immediately, but too quickly. Renato saw. He didn't see the name of the sender, but he saw his son's movement. And the movement said enough. "Is it her?" he asked. Cowan didn't answer immediately. "Cowan." "Yes." The word came out small. Renato took a deep breath through his nose, not out of irritation, out of processing. Vivian was at the salon and, at the same time, was texting the son, which meant she was managing two fronts at the same time, the one of normalcy with her husband and the one of alignment with her son. The fact that she was doing this at that specific moment, a few hours after Renato had arrived home without warning, indicated that she was more insecure than she had shown in the kitchen in the morning. "What's she asking?" Renato said. "If you said anything to me." The near mistake came slowly, but it came with precision. If Cowan told Vivian that his father had come home and that they had talked, she would know that Renato knew. If he didn't answer, she would be on alert. And if he lied saying no, she might come home more relaxed than she should be. Each option had a different consequence for how the next few hours would unfold. Renato weighed this for a few seconds. "Tell her I got home tired and went to lie down." He said that we didn't cross paths much. Cowan looked at his father with an expression that mixed surprise with something closer to involuntary respect. Then he picked up his phone, typed, sent, put the device back on the table with the screen up. This time she replied in less than a minute. An okay and a heart emoji. They both looked at the screen without commenting. There was a discreet irony in that heart that Renato chose not to name. "Are you staying here tonight?" Cowan asked. "I am, at least tonight." His son nodded. There was an implicit question in that, at least, that Cowan had clearly heard, but chose not to ask out loud. It was a maturity that Renato noticed and filed away. They were both silent for a while. It wasn't the uncomfortable silence of before. It was a different silence. The kind that exists between people who have just put a difficult thing into words and are still adjusting to the lesser weight that words give when the thing is finally said. From outside, the noise of late afternoon traffic rose up to the apartment. A horn, an accelerating engine, the muffled sound of music from a passing car. Sao Paulo, continuing its own rhythm, completely oblivious to what was being reorganized inside that apartment. "Dad," Cowan said without looking at his father, "I should have told you in September when I saw the car. I should have spoken that morning when I started and stopped. I should have." "I know," Renato agreed without softening, without adding anything. His son opened his mouth as if to continue and closed it. Renato got up from the sofa, took the empty glass, went to the kitchen, filled it with water, drank it with his back to the hallway. When he returned to the living room, Cowan had picked up his backpack and was going to his own room. "Cowan," his son stopped. "The conversation we still need to have, we will have, but not today." Cowan stood with his back to him for a second, then continued walking. The bedroom door closed carefully without a sound. Renato sat back on the sofa. The apartment was quiet again, with that specific quiet of a place where more than one thing is happening, behind closed doors at the same time. He stared at the hallway for a while. Vivian would be home in less than an hour, and he still hadn't decided if that night was the time to end the intact surface or if there was a concrete reason to wait one more day. Except there was something he had heard from Cowan that was still incomplete. His son had said the car showed up about 3 times that he saw. He had said it could have been more when he wasn't there. But he hadn't said how long before September that it started. And Renato still didn't know if he wanted to hear that answer from Cowan or if he preferred to hear it from the only person who had that complete answer. Vivian's key in the lock made the same sound as always. That double click that Renato had heard thousands of times without paying attention. This time, he paid attention. It was almost 6 in the evening. The apartment had been quiet after Cowan went to his room. A dense quiet that Renato didn't try to fill. He stayed on the sofa with no television, no cell phone with the afternoon light coming through the window and slowly changing tone as the sun went down. It was the kind of waiting that doesn't speed up, no matter how much you want it to, that has its own rhythm and doesn't negotiate. Vivian came in with her hair blow-dried, straight. That salon result that lasted 2 days before going back to natural. She carried her purse on her shoulder and a small pharmacy bag in her hand. When she saw Renato on the sofa, the smile appeared quickly and with the right quality, not too anxious, not too cold. Still awake? She threw the keys in a fruit bowl by the entrance, as she always did. I thought you were sleeping. I couldn't. She went to the kitchen, put the pharmacy bag on the counter, opened the fridge, stood for a few seconds looking at the contents. I'll make something quick for dinner. Do you want pasta, or would you rather order something? You can order. She closed the fridge, came to the living room with her phone in her hand, sat on the side armchair, the same one where Cowan had sat hours before, and started opening some delivery app, Japanese or pizza. Whatever. She looked at her husband for a second, with that expression of someone checking the other's mood before making a small decision. Are you okay? You look tired. I am. Was the trip hard? It was. She went back to her phone, was choosing, scrolling through the menu, making that sequence of automatic gestures of someone with a divided attention. And as she did that, Renato watched her, not with anger, not with any visible emotion on his face, with the specific attention of someone who is recording every detail of a scene for the last time, before it changes its nature forever. She was a beautiful woman, always had been. She had the kind of beauty that doesn't depend on effort, that exists in the structure of the face, in the way she moved, in a combination of physical things and presence that Renato had noticed 11 years ago at a barbecue party, and that still existed. That didn't make anything easier, but it was true, and he had always valued truth above comfort. I ordered pizza, she said without looking up. 30 minutes. Okay. She put her phone on the coffee table and sat for a moment with her elbows on her knees. Is Cowan asleep? He went to his room. Did you talk a little? A 3-second pause. Then she said in a tone calibrated to sound casual. Did you say anything about the project to him? And there was the near mistake, and this time it wasn't small. It was the second time she was checking what Renato had said to his son. First by message in the afternoon, now in person. She was mapping what he knew, measuring what he had conveyed. It was a smart approach to check through the intermediary instead of asking directly, but it only worked if the intermediary was aligned with her, which was no longer the case since the afternoon. Renato replied without varying a bit. I told him I came early because of the contract, that the next stage would start faster than expected. She nodded. Oh, I see. Satisfied with the answer, or convinced enough to let her guard down for now. Renato stared at her for a second, then said, Vivian, I need to show you something. The tone of the sentence was neutral, the kind that gives nothing away. She looked up with a genuine expression of curiosity. What? He took his phone out of his pocket, opened a recent calls app, went to the video call from yesterday, the 22:4. The app saved the last frames of videos made by the camera, a technical detail that most people don't know exists. The image was there frozen grainy, like any compressed video capture, but legible. The badge, the pillow, the blue lanyard. He turned the phone towards her. Vivian looked at the screen. The process was fast and slow at the same time, as it always is when something big happens in a short space. He saw the exact moment her face understood what she was seeing. It wasn't dramatic. There was no scream. There wasn't the kind of reaction that exists in movies. It was a subtraction, as if something had left her face instead of entering. As if the layers she had kept intact all day, from the calculated smile at the salon to the casual question about Cowan, had dismantled itself in silence. She stared at the screen for a few seconds, then looked away. Not at Renato, at the window. He lowered the phone, waited. The silence that followed was different from any silence they had had before. It wasn't the silence of marriage. It wasn't the discomfort of a couple. It wasn't that daily tension that passes on its own. It was the silence after a door closes, definitive, with its own texture. Vivian stared at the window for a time Renato didn't measure. When she finally spoke, Her voice had lost that controlled tone of the whole day. It wasn't trembling, but it was different, closer to real. Since when did you know? I saw it last night. She closed her eyes for a moment, opened them, and the whole trip like this. It wasn't a question. It was a statement that carried within it the dimension of what he had done. Staying silent for hours, getting through the night, taking the early morning plane, spending the whole day by her side without saying anything. She was recalibrating the size of the situation in real time. Gustavo, she said, not as an explanation, as a confirmation of the name, as if she needed to put into words what the image had already said. Yes, a pause. How long? He asked. She was quiet. Vivian, 8 months. The voice came out low, but clear. It started in March on a team trip we took to Curitiba. A pause. I know it doesn't change anything to say this, but it wasn't planned. Renato remained silent. Not because he had nothing to answer, but because there was a logic in her sentence that he needed to let pass before continuing. It wasn't planned was the kind of thing people say when they need a version of the story where they are less responsible for what they did. He knew that construction. He had seen it in negotiations, in construction situations, in contract disputes. It was always the first attempt to reduce the size of the damage before knowing how much the other side already knew. And Cowan, he said. She took a deep breath. He found out in September, the car. I know. He told me today. This time her silence was different. There was a contained surprise there, of realizing that her son had spoken before she expected. She was recalculating again, measuring what Renato already had and what was still missing. Did you ask him not to tell? Renato said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact. Yes. Why? She hesitated. Because I thought I could solve it before it became a bigger problem. Solve it how? She didn't answer. Renato stared at her for a moment. There was a question hanging in the room, implicit in everything that had been said, but that neither of them had named yet. It was the question of what she wanted, of whether there was an intention to leave, to stay, of how much those 8 months had meant to her beyond what she was describing. But he didn't ask that question. Not at that moment. Not because he was afraid of the answer, but because the answer didn't change what he already knew needed to happen. The intercom rang. The pizza had arrived. They both stood still for a second, looking at each other with the absurd awareness that the world continued to function at its own pace while this was happening. Vivian got up, went to the intercom, told the doorman he could come up. Renato stayed on the sofa. She opened the door for the delivery guy, took the box, brought it to the kitchen, put it on the table, stood with her back to him with her hands on the edge of the sink, her head slightly bowed. Renato didn't go to the kitchen. He stayed on the sofa, looking at the hallway. The smell of pizza was spreading through the apartment, that specific smell that usually meant Friday night. Movie, the kind of simple thing that's part of routine built over years. That night, the smell only made the contrast sharper. From Cowan's room came no sound. Vivian came back to the living room, stood halfway between the kitchen and the sofa, with her arms crossed, not in a defensive posture, but the way people cross their arms when they're trying to contain themselves. What do you want to do? She asked. It was the first time she had put the decision on his side. It was a transfer that Renato noticed, and that said something about where she was not necessarily regretful, but tired of holding up a structure that had cracked. He was silent for a moment. Tonight I'll sleep here, he said. Tomorrow we'll talk for real. She nodded, uncrossed her arms, went back to the kitchen without saying anything else. Renato stayed on the sofa, looking at the ceiling, while he heard the sound of her serving herself in the kitchen alone, the plate being pulled from the cabinet, the chair scraping on the floor. And it was at that moment, in that domestic late-night sound, that he realized there was a question he still hadn't asked. That 8 months was her answer. But Cowan had said he saw the Corolla for the first time in September, that the car had appeared about 3 times that he saw, but 3 times in 2 months, with someone who clearly had the ease to be there, wasn't the behavior of a relationship that was 2 months old. 8 months was the version she had given, and Renato still didn't know if it was the truth or if it was the number she had calculated as the least damaging to reveal. Renato woke up at 5:40 in the morning with his body still on Porto Velho time. The room was dark, the air conditioner on low, and Vivian was sleeping on her side of the bed with that regular breathing of someone who managed to sleep despite everything. He lay for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling, listening to the city below, still at a pre-dawn pace, few cars, no horns, the sound of a garbage truck passing on the parallel street. He got up without making a noise, took his clothes from the day before that were on the chair in the corner, left the room, closed the door carefully. In the kitchen, he made coffee on the stove, the way he learned from his father, cloth filter, hot water on top, slowly without haste. He stood at the edge of the sink while the coffee brewed, looking out the kitchen window at the gradual lightening of the sky between the buildings. Sao Paulo dawns in a specific gray that gets lighter in layers, never all at once. He observed this process for a few minutes, without thinking about anything structured, just existing in that space before the day truly begins. He filled his cup, sat at the kitchen table. It was the same table where they had coffee every weekday for 11 years. A darkwood table, 4 chairs, a fruit bowl in the center that almost always had bananas and sometimes apples. The everyday printed in every detail of a place, that silent accumulation of routine that only appears when you know it's about to end. He was on his second cup when he heard footsteps in the hallway. Vivian appeared at the kitchen entrance in pajamas, her hair tied up hastily, her eyes still heavy with sleep. She looked at her husband, sitting at the table, and stood for a second before entering. There was on her face the awareness that the conversation they had postponed the night before was waiting in that kitchen, at that time, before the day filled the apartment with distractions. She went to the stove, poured coffee, came to sit in the chair next to him, not the one in front, the one on the side. A small detail, but one that Renato noticed was the chair she sat in on normal mornings, out of habit. She was trying, even at that moment, to keep something familiar. For a while, they both sat with their cups in front of them, the sound of the coffee brewing in the silence of the kitchen, the city outside waking up slowly. It was Renato who started. I asked 8 months last night, and you confirmed. He didn't look up from his cup as he said it. But 11 months ago, in January, you went to a 3-day conference in Florianopolis with the team. And when you came back, you were different. Not in a way I could name at the time, but you were. Vivian was quiet. I'm not asking to double the number. I'm asking because I need to know what's true. She looked at her cup, was silent for a time that was too long to be innocent. It was in January, she said finally. Her voice came out without intonation, flat. The voice of someone who has reached the limit of sustaining a lesser version. Florianopolis. 11 months? Not 8. Renato said nothing. There was nothing to say that the confirmation hadn't already said. He held his cup, looking at the pattern of the wood on the table, as if he were examining something that had always been there and that he had never really seen. Why did you say 8? He asked. She hesitated. Because I thought it would be less difficult to hear. Less difficult for me, or less difficult for you to explain? She didn't answer. Renato put his cup on the table carefully. He kept his hands open on the wood, looking at his own hands. They were the hands of a man who had spent 20 years in construction, who had shaken the hands of hundreds of people in contracts, who had carried project blueprints, who had fixed broken things at home, because he always found it easier to do than to call someone. Hands that had built concrete things for a long time. Is Gustavo married? He said. It wasn't a question. Yes. Does his wife know? I don't know. Did you think about that at any point? She took a deep breath. I thought about it, and I didn't do anything with that thought. There was an honesty in that answer that Renato wasn't expecting. It was easier to deal with denial, with the version where the person constructs a narrative of being a victim of circumstances. What she was doing was more uncomfortable. She was placing the responsibility where it was, without wrapping it up. He didn't know if it was genuine awareness or just the exhaustion of someone who no longer has the energy to pretend. Were you going to tell me? He asked. She was silent. Vivian, I was waiting for the Porto Velho contract to end. Her voice was low but firm. You were going to come back for good in December. I had it in my head that I was going to have a conversation before the year turned. What conversation? She looked at him for the first time since she had sat down. Her eyes had an expression that took Renato a few seconds to identify. It wasn't guilt in the conventional sense. It was that kind of exhaustion of someone who has carried a decision for too long without really making it, that I didn't know if I wanted to continue anymore. The sentence hung in the kitchen air. Renato stared at her. He didn't feel the impact he might have expected to feel. It was like a confirmation of something that was already implicit in everything that had been said before, the logical step of a sequence he was already following. When someone spends 11 months inside another parallel story, the question of continuing or not has already been answered by action. The verbalization was just the document arriving after the decision. I see, he said. She stared at him. Okay, I understand what you said. A pause. You're not going to say anything. What do you want me to say? She had no answer. There was an undeclared expectation in her question that he would react in some way that she could use as a reference to calibrate what came next. Screaming, crying, accusations, anything that had temperature. His calmness was pulling the rug out from under her. Renato got up, went to the hallway. She heard him open the bedroom closet, the sound of a backpack drawer being moved. When he came back to the kitchen, he was carrying the backpack he had arrived with from Porto Velho, now with a few more pieces of clothes folded inside. Vivian stared at the backpack. Are you leaving now? I'm going to sleep at my dad's for a few days. He took the car keys from on top of the fruit bowl. I'll leave the apartment keys here, Renato. Her voice had changed tone. There was an urgency that wasn't there before. We can talk more. Can we? We've already talked. He said this without harshness, without the cut of someone who is angry. It was a technical statement. They had talked. Everything that needed to be said had been said. The rest was bureaucracy. She was silent. He went to the apartment entrance, stopped with his hand on the doorknob. There was one thing he needed to check before leaving. Not for her, but for the sake of completeness in his own reasoning. Does Gustavo know you were waiting to end this before the end of the year? She was silent for a moment. He knows I wasn't going to leave my marriage for him. Renato stood with his back to her for a second, processing this. It was new information that slightly changed the outline of the situation, not the center, but the outlines. Gustavo wasn't expecting an exit. It was a relationship that existed within the limits she had established, which meant there was a coldness of calculation there, which was, in a way, more disturbing than the passionate version would have been. He opened the door. Renato. Her voice came from the back of the kitchen, quieter now. I'm sorry. He stood in the doorway for a moment. I know you are, he said without turning, and left. The hallway on his floor was empty at that early morning hour. He waited for the elevator, went down, crossed the lobby without stopping at the doorman's counter. Outside, the morning air was fresh, the way it only is at that hour, before the traffic gets heavy and the Sao Paulo heat sets in. He put the backpack in the back seat of the car, got in, sat for a few seconds before starting the engine. There was something that was occupying a specific place in the back of his mind, a piece that had been loose since the conversation in the kitchen. Vivian had said that Gustavo knew she wasn't going to leave the marriage for him, but if she herself had just said she didn't know if she wanted to continue anymore. And if that conversation she planned to have in December was about that, then at some point Gustavo would know that the plans had changed, or he already knew. And if he already knew, there was a question that Renato hadn't asked and that he wasn't going to be able to get an answer to from Vivian. What was Gustavo going to do with that information? He started the engine, drove off towards his father's house, with that unanswered question inside the car, traveling with him through the traffic that was starting to thicken on the avenues of Sao Paulo on a Friday morning. Dorival opened the door before Renato rang the bell. The old man had heard the car parking in front of the house. The way people who live alone for a long time develop a sensitivity to external movement that borders on instinct. He was in shorts and a white t-shirt, rubber sandals, breakfast clearly already made because there was a smell of toast coming from the kitchen. He looked at his son, looked at the backpack on his son's shoulder, and opened the door. He didn't ask anything else. Renato came in, put the backpack in the corner of the hallway, went straight to the kitchen, sat at the table. Dorival followed, served a cup without being asked, put it in front of his son, sat on the opposite side with his own cup already half empty. They were silent for a while, which would be uncomfortable between any other combination of people, but between them was just the usual way of operating. Dorival was a man who had never confused talking with communicating. He communicated in other ways, by his presence, by his gestures, by the toast that was on the plate in the center of the table, without anyone having asked for it. "I'm staying here for a few days, if it's no problem," Renato said. "The back room is made up." That's it. No explanation required, no question about what had happened. If Renato wanted to talk, he would. If he didn't, the back room was made up all the same. Renato stayed at his father's that whole weekend. He slept more than he was used to. The kind of heavy sleep that comes when the body finally lets its guard down after days of functioning at the limit. He ate what Dorival made. Simple things, rice, beans, a roasted chicken on Saturday with the smell of rosemary that spread throughout the house. He helped the old man change a dripping faucet in the service bathroom. They spent 2 hours on a job that should have taken 40 minutes because Dorival insisted on doing it the way he learned and Renato insisted on a more efficient method, and neither of them was wrong. They were just having the usual argument about it. It was on Sunday afternoon that Renato sent the message to Cowan, simple, direct. "Stop by Grandpa's house tomorrow afternoon around 3. I need to talk to you." The reply took about 15 minutes. "Okay, Dad." On Monday, Renato went out in the morning, went to a law firm downtown that a construction colleague had recommended years ago in a conversation about estate planning. He spent an hour and a half with a lawyer, a man of about 50 named Elio, methodical, no-nonsense, the kind who takes notes by hand and doesn't use a tablet. Renato explained the situation in general terms. Elio asked objective questions about the length of the marriage, property regime, real estate, ongoing financing. Renato answered everything. When he left, he had a clear vision of what was necessary from a legal point of view and a realistic timeline of how long the process would take if conducted without dispute. The word Elio had used more than once was consensual. If both parties cooperated, it would be faster, cheaper, and less draining. Renato held on to that word as he went down in the office elevator, consensual. He didn't know yet if Vivian would cooperate or not, but he knew he would cooperate regardless, because the idea of dragging it out for months in a dispute seemed like a waste of energy he needed for other things. He got back to his father's house shortly after noon. Dorival was watching something on the living room television, the volume low, as always, and nodded when his son came in, without asking where he had been. Cowan arrived at 3:05 in the afternoon. Renato was on the back porch of the house, a small porch with 2 iron chairs and a view of the garden that his father maintained with the dedication of a retiree who has more time than projects. He heard the old man open the front door, heard his grandson's voice greeting him. He heard Dorival indicate the porch with few words. When Cowan appeared at the porch door opening, he was in jeans and a t-shirt, backpack on his back, his face with that expression of someone who has been summoned without knowing exactly what to expect. "Hi, Dad. Sit down." Cowan pulled up the chair and sat. Dorival appeared a second later, with 2 glasses of water, placed them on the porch railing, and went back to the living room without saying anything, closing the door between the 2 spaces. The old man had a specific talent for calibrating how much space a situation needed. Renato looked at the garden for a moment before speaking. There was a lemon tree in the corner that his father had planted about 12 years ago, which had taken a while to take hold, but now produced more than any family could consume. "You've probably been expecting this conversation since Sunday," Renato said. "More or less. Then I'll be direct." Cowan was quiet, with his hands open on his thighs, his elbows on his knees, the posture of someone who is prepared to hear something heavy and is trying to keep their body in a position that can withstand it. Renato turned to him, looked at his son attentively, not with harshness, but with the seriousness of someone about to say something he considers too important to be said without full presence. "I understand you were in a position you didn't ask to be in. I understand you found out by accident, and that she put you in an impossible place." A pause. "But you kept something that directly concerned me for 2 months. And that was a choice. Every week that passed was a choice." Cowan stared at the garden floor. "You don't need to defend yourself now. I'm not here for an argument. I'm here to tell you what's going to change." His son looked up. "The $325 allowance I deposit every first of the month ends on the 30th of this month, last deposit." Cowan was quiet. "The college tuition, the $435 a month, ends on the same deadline. You have until February to request a transfer to a federal university, or find another way to pay for the course. Enough time to resolve it without losing the semester. A pause. The room in the apartment is available until the end of the lease, which expires in March. After that, the apartment's configuration changes anyway, so that resolves itself. Cowan opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Dad, let me finish. His son was silent. I'm not doing this out of anger. If it were anger, I would have done it on Thursday when you opened the door. And I saw on your face that you knew. Anger doesn't take 3 days to organize. Renato spoke slowly, with the same tone as someone explaining a technical specification without excessive emotional variation. I'm doing it because there's a difference between being in a difficult situation and making a choice. And you chose for 2 months. That choice has consequences. Consequences are not punishment. They are results. Cowan's eyes were moist, but nothing had slipped out. He was making the same effort of containment that Renato recognized, because it was the same effort he himself had made in difficult times over the years. It was a family thing, this of not breaking down in front of others, even when everything inside is in motion. You can continue to have a relationship with me, Renato said. That doesn't change, and you can continue to have a relationship with her too. She's your stepmother, and what happened between us doesn't cancel out 11 years of living with you. That's your right, and I won't interfere. A pause. But what I've paid for until now, I paid for as the father of son I thought had learned that when things get tough, you do the right thing. I need to recalibrate what I'm paying for in light of what I've learned. The garden was quiet. A light breeze rustled the leaves of the lemon tree. Inside, the muffled sound of DeRival's television continued at the same low volume, a discreet presence that marked that the world continued to exist beyond that porch. Cowan was silent for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was controlled, but with visible effort. I should have spoken. I know that. I know you know. I tried. The morning I was telling you, and I stopped. I remember. I should have continued. You should have. There was nothing more to add to that. The conversation had reached the place where things are after the truth has been spoken on each side, and the air became cleaner. Not lighter, but cleaner. They're different things. Cowan looked at the garden for a moment, then got up, picked up his backpack, stood for a second with the strap in his hand, as if he were calculating if there was anything else to say. You'll be okay, he asked. It was a simple question that carried more than its size. It was the son asking about the father from a place that wasn't that of a child asking for reassurance. It was that of someone who has just understood that the adult in front of him is also going through something real. I will be, Renato said. Cowan nodded, went to the porch door, opened it, stopped in the doorway. Dad, I'm sorry. Renato looked at his son. I know you are. Cowan went inside. Renato heard him greet his grandfather in the living room. He heard DeRival answer with the minimum he always answered. He heard the front door open and close. The silence that remained was different from the one before Cowan arrived. It was a silence that had been worked on, that had something resolved within it. Not everything, but something. DeRival opened the porch door a while later. He came with 2 cups of coffee that hadn't been requested. He placed one on the railing near his son, stood with his own cup, looking at the lemon tree. Was it good, he said. It was. The old man nodded slightly, drank his coffee. They stood there for a while, father and son, each with their own cup, looking at the garden without needing anything more than that. Renato knew he had a dense week ahead of him. The lawyer would need documentation. Vivian would need to be formally notified. The apartment, the contract, the division of assets. There was a list of concrete things that required attention and that he would face one at a time, the way he always faced any big project, without trying to solve everything on the same day, without letting the size of the whole paralyze the next step. But there was something that was still loose, that he had put aside for the last few days, because there were other priorities, and that now, with the silence of the garden around him, came back with clarity. Vivian had said that Gustavo knew she wasn't going to leave the marriage for him. But now the marriage was ending, and Renato didn't know if Gustavo already knew that. He didn't know if Vivian had told him. He didn't know what that man would do with the information when he found out. And there was a final question that no one had answered yet, that had been stored away since the conversation in the kitchen, and that, suddenly, seemed more relevant than it had seemed before. Did Gustavo Mayrels' wife know that her husband had been in another story for 11 months? And if she didn't know, what would happen when she did? The contract was open on a laptop screen when his cell phone rang. It was a Tuesday afternoon in February, 3 months after Porto Velho. Renato was sitting at the table of his new apartment, a 2-bedroom in a simpler neighborhood, for kilometers from the previous one, with a window overlooking a street with trees and a neighborhood silence he didn't expect to find within Sao Paulo. The apartment was smaller, the rent was lower, and there was a specific lightness in having only what fit in that space, chosen things. Nothing accumulated by inertia. The cell phone showed a number he didn't have in his contacts. He answered, Renato Sebra. The voice was female, direct, with the objectivity of someone calling with a purpose. It's him. My name is Adriana Mayrels. A 1-second pause. I'm married to Gustavo Mayrels. Renato was silent. Not out of surprise exactly. It was a call that on some level he had considered possible in recent months, but had dismissed as unlikely. Gustavo's wife had found his number somehow and had decided to call. That said something about where she was. I know who you are, he said. Then you know why I'm calling. I can imagine. I found out 3 weeks ago. Her voice had that specific texture of someone who has passed the acute state of shock to something colder, more organized, more dangerous from an emotional point of view, because it already had structure. Not from him, from a photo that appeared on a cell phone in the wrong place. Renato knew the mechanics of it. It wasn't much different from a badge on a pillow. Why are you calling me? He asked. Because I wanted to know from someone who was on the same side as me the real size of what happened. He gave me one version. I needed another perspective before making any decisions. There was a rationality in that approach that Renato respected without needing to verbalize it. It was a woman trying to get complete information before acting. It was exactly what he himself had done in different ways throughout those weeks in November. I can tell you what I know from my side, he said, but I don't know everything from your side. I understand. How long did it last? 11 months. It started in January last year on a work trip they took to Florianopolis. A long silence on the other end. He told me it was 4 months, she said finally. Her voice didn't break, but there was a different quality to it now, as if something was being squeezed inside. I found out about 11 from Vivian directly. Another silence. Thank you, she said. The word came out clean, without drama. It was the thanks of someone who received information that will cost dearly, but was necessary. Good luck, Renato said. The call ended. He put the phone on the table, stared at the dark screen for a moment. There was an uncomfortable symmetry in that call. Two people who would never have a reason to talk under normal circumstances, connected by the same chain of choices made by other people. He didn't feel satisfaction from that. He felt the neutral weight of a piece of information that left one side and arrived at another, and that would generate consequences that were no longer his business. He went back to the contract on the laptop screen. It was the renewal of the Porto Velho project, the second phase, bigger than the first. The partner construction company had sent the draft the week before. Renato had spent 2 days reviewing it clause by clause, adjusting 2 points that were not his favor, sent it back with the changes. They had accepted both. The contract on the screen was the final version ready for signature. He read the entire document one more time, from beginning to end, as he always did, not out of distrust, out of habit. It was the discipline of someone who learned early that big problems almost always live in details that most people don't read because they're in a hurry to get to the end. When he finished reading, he hovered the cursor over the digital signature field for a moment. He signed, sent, closed the laptop. The 3 months that had passed since that November morning when he left the apartment with a backpack hadn't been simple, and he wasn't going to pretend they had been. There was an emotional and practical bureaucracy in undoing 11 years of joint construction that doesn't get resolved quickly, regardless of how much clarity a person has about the decision. The divorce process had gone the consensual route, as Elio had predicted. Vivian hadn't put up any obstacles, had cooperated with the documentation, had responded to the lawyers on time. There was something in her cooperation that Renato interpreted not as residual affection, but as a recognition that she owed him that this clean exit, this bureaucracy conducted without war. The division of assets had been straightforward. The apartment was hers, with the financing along with it. He had left with the car, with the financial reserve that was entirely his, built over years of work, with the discipline of someone who doesn't spend what they don't have. It was enough to start over without tightness and without needing favors. The new apartment he had chosen on his own one weekend, without anyone's opinion. He had visited 4 options on a Saturday morning with a realtor who spoke less than the average realtor and showed the properties without unnecessary comments. The second one he visited was this one, with the window overlooking the trees and the silence he didn't expect. He had signed a contract the following Monday, moved in with the minimum, sold what didn't fit in the new space, donated the rest. There was a surprising lightness in having fewer things than before. It was a discovery he didn't know he would make, and that stayed with him. Cowan had requested the transfer to the Federal University in January, as his father had advised. He was accepted. The course was the same, administration, and he had sent a dry message saying, "I got the transfer. I start in March." Renato had replied, "Good." Nothing more from either of them. There was a distance there that had a different texture from the distance before. It wasn't the distance of someone keeping a secret. It was the distance of 2 people reorganizing the terms of a relationship after a shock. It was a distance that could decrease with time, but that needed the time. With Vivian, the contact had been 0 after the divorce was signed. Not out of declared resentment, not by agreed protocol. There was simply no more topic that required conversation, and they both seemed to have reached that conclusion independently. There was something honest in that final silence that was more dignified than any elaborate farewell would have been, that she and Gustavo had broken up 6 weeks after the discovery. Renato found out from a colleague who worked in the same business park where the consulting firm was located in a conversation about another topic where the name had come up in passing. He didn't seek out this information. It came to him on its own, as these things do. He felt nothing specific upon hearing it. It was information that didn't change anything that was already resolved. That February afternoon, after signing the contract, he went to the kitchen and made coffee. He looked out the window while the water heated. The street below had a slower rhythm than the avenues of the previous neighborhood. Fewer cars, more people on foot, a lady walking a small dog on the cobblestone sidewalk. The following Sunday, Dorival showed up at 9 in the morning with a bag, cheese bread from a bakery he had frequented for 20 years, and a package of coffee he always bought at the same market. Renato opened the door. The old man came in without ceremony, went straight to the kitchen, put the bag on the counter, and started opening the coffee package as if he were in his own home. "Have you had coffee yet?" Dorival asked. "Not yet." "Then it's time." They both had coffee on the small balcony of the new apartment, looking at the street with trees. Dorival ate 3 cheese breads without talking about anything substantial. He commented on the weather, that it was cloudy toward the marginal, but that it was nice there. He commented that the lemon tree had had an unusual production that month, and that he didn't know what to do with so many lemons. Renato said he would go there to get some the following week. They sat for a while after the cheese breads with their empty cups, and the street below in the quiet Sunday rhythm. Dorival didn't ask how Renato was. He didn't ask about the process, about the apartment, about work, about anything. He was just there, the way the old man had always been, with that presence that demands nothing, but that occupies the space in a way that makes the place less empty. On Monday morning, the confirmation of the Porto Velho contract came back signed by the partner construction company. The second phase would begin in April. It was a bigger project than anything he had handled alone until then, with a better margin and with a team he himself had assembled in recent weeks, choosing each engineer by his own criteria, without pressure from a partner or a large company structure. He read the confirmation email, sitting at the table of the new apartment, with the window open and the light sound of the street coming through the gap. He closed the computer, sat for a moment with his hands open on the table. There was a lightness in that moment that wasn't euphoria. It was quieter than that, firmer. It was the feeling of being exactly where he was, in a smaller apartment, on a Monday morning, with a signed contract and a life that fit within the space it actually occupied, with nothing faked, nothing maintained by inertia or fear of doing things differently. He had left a structure that he had spent years supporting without realizing how much it cost to support it. And on the outside of that structure, the air was cleaner than he expected. The cell phone was on the table. He looked at the screen for a moment, then picked it up, opened his contacts, and dialed a number. Elio answered on the second ring. Renato, can I help you? You can. I need to regularize something in the second phase contract before we start. Do you have time this week? Thursday afternoon. That's great. Confirmed. Renato hung up, put the phone back on the table, and opened the laptop again. There was work ahead. The kind of work that is yours, that you chose, that depends on what you decide to do with each hour of the day. And for now, on that February morning, with the sun coming through the window of the trees and Sao Paulo functioning outside at its usual rhythm, that was exactly enough.